Hello, how's it going? You are all very welcome to the, as they say, the inaugural episode of the Peadar O'Donnell Podcast. Inaugural, it's a very fancy word for first. But I thought I'd use fancy language for that for the first episode. My name is Peadar O'Donnell, and this is my podcast. For anybody who doesn't know me, I am a fella from Killygarry, and I suppose I only recently discovered the whole idea of podcasts, and somebody suggested it to me because I'll be very honest now. I am 31 years of age, but I suppose I kind of fell behind with regards to the whole world of the internet. When I was a teenager, I suppose I was a wee bit more quiet, and I didn't really get beyond Bebo, which I signed up for, but everybody else jumped ship to Facebook, and I suppose I didn't jump with them for a while, but that kind of suited me because I was doing a lot of soul searching, as they say. Basically, what I do, I like to paint. I'm lucky enough that I'm able to make a living from my paintings. I do lovely landscapes like the likes of the Bob Ross or good old David Willis, where I learnt my trade as I was a teenager. But as I've started to make a lot of new discoveries in the world, particularly in the world of the internet, I decided that I would share some of these discoveries with you, and I suppose we can go from there. So, if you listen very carefully, you might hear the rumbling or the crackling of my fireplace. You might also hear my laptop, which is also here, but you might hear my fireplace, and in that fireplace obviously is burning a fire, and in there is Cozy Glow, the little eggs that burn, and on top of that is some logs for the fire. And the reason why I'm telling you about these things is because that is kind of related and connected to what we are going to be talking about this evening. Because this evening, or well, it depends on when you're listening to this podcast. It could be during the day, but I'm recording this in the evening, so I'm just going to say that. But basically, I discovered a thing on the internet called climate change, and basically they say that the whole world is heating up, and to be very honest, it all sounds quite scary. Basically, what is happening is that there's a lot of carbon being thrown into the atmosphere. Basically, the huge, as they called it, the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, basically resulted in a lot of coal being burnt, because before that coal wasn't so much used, but the Industrial Revolution really kicked it up a gear, as they say, and so they started burning loads and loads of coal, and that was really good for industry, because they were able to get a lot more things done, and the likes of the steam engine they were able to use as well, and sure, then ultimately then they started coming into the 20th century, they started burning oil as well, the crude oil, which is, I suppose, these are what they call fossil fuels. And the reason why they're called fossil fuels is because they're made of fossils, basically, because they're deep down in the ground, and I suppose they used to be animals years ago, or either animals or different kinds of as they say, organic matter, Now, for anybody who doesn't know, I'm from Ireland. For anybody, oh goodness, I better turn off my phone. Um, for anybody listening from abroad, I am from Ireland, and well, I suppose as I said, I'm burning coal, or the smokeless coal as they call it, and some wood. But one of the big things that kind of classically, I suppose, that we would burn here is turf, uh, and uh, and or as some people would know it, peat, and sometimes it can get condensed down into the briquettes, which are the dark little bricks, which are good. But classically, and I spent many a day out in the bog cutting turf when I was away when I was younger. Although, to be very honest, listening to a lot of this climate change stuff, it starts to get a bit scary because, well, what the turf is, it's basically, it's been years and years of leaves and plant matter which has died because back in the Stone Age, there was a huge ecological disaster. I discovered this. I went to the Cage Fields, which is down in County Mayo, in the west of Ireland, and at the Cage Fields, there's these loads of stone walls. Most of which is under bog, but they know they're there because they were able to poke them with a stick, and they were able to draw a map, and work out where all the walls were. But what they were able to work out, because they were so deep, seemingly underground, but what they realised was basically back in the day, whenever people first started to farm here in Ireland, they started to cut down a lot of trees. And the thing, if you don't know about Ireland, but I think a lot of people do know, is that Ireland can be very rainy, and because of that, well, Ireland used to be covered in trees, a lot of deciduous trees. They're the trees that they lose all their leaves in the winter time, but sure they grow them back for in the spring and in the summertime, and they're beautiful. But the old farmers, the ancient farmers, I suppose, because they were very ancient, they decided to clear some of these trees because they thought that they could use the landscape better for farming, because they used to have a lot of cows and a lot of different things like that. And they thought, you know what, we don't need these trees anymore, so we're going to cut them down and we're going to have these lovely big grassy fields for the cows, and we can build these little stone walls. But of course, what they didn't realise was that when all the rain was landing on the trees, whenever the trees were there, most of that moisture from the air, or most of the moisture from the sky, the rain itself, the precipitation is the fancy word I discovered for it. Basically, it wasn't really getting absorbed into the ground so much. A lot of it was either landing on the leaves, and whenever it got a wee bit brighter again, it would actually evaporate back into the atmosphere. Or alternatively, it would, if it did make it down to the ground, it would get absorbed by the trees anyway. So the trees were very good, but once you got rid of those trees, that water had nowhere to go, and there was a whole load of water that ended up just soaking up into the ground, and oh, it was terrible. The land just became boggy and saturated, and very soon the farmers probably would have found out that they couldn't really they couldn't really grow a lot of stuff there, and I'd imagine it just became less and less suitable for farming. and it's quite possible. I think the people at the Cajun Fields Heritage Centre nowadays, they reckon that they probably possibly abandoned these farms because they became quite useless, because they're right out on the cliff edge, kind of looking down across at Donegal Bay, and it. Because it got all so saturated, and probably because it got abandoned, years and years, we're talking thousands of years here, folks. What I think, off the top of my head, it might be about 5,000 odd years old, and because of that, you had built millennia, as they say, millennia of built up dead plants, and if there were leaves or different things that basically died but rotted there on the ground, and that built up and built up and built up over time, and that eventually became probably about 8 or 9 feet worth of what became turf, because it was all just condensed on the ground. And sure, nowadays, when we go out to the bog now, because a lot of people think, when we see the nice, beautiful bogs here in Ireland, that it's a big natural feature. But a lot of that would have actually been a very early ecological disaster, a man-made ecological disaster. But nowadays we go out and we cut the turf, we cut that. It's this lovely brown, grainy kind of thing, and we cut it when it's wet and we let it dry. And then later we throw it in the fire, and it makes a lovely little a fire altogether. And people have been doing that in Ireland for years and years. But then during the Industrial Revolution, there was something like that, only it wasn't from thousands of years ago. It wasn't from thousands of years ago. It was from tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions and millions of years ago, that the likes of the coal and then later the oil was made. This was carbon, because the way it works is basically the trees, like whenever we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. Now, fair enough, we do also breathe out a wee bit of oxygen as well, but we'll not get into that. But we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon. And plants essentially do the opposite to that, where they breathe in carbon, or carbon dioxide to be very specific, carbon dioxide, and they breathe out oxygen. So they actually help us breathe, and we help them breathe. So it's what they call a symbiotic relationship. But basically, what I discovered was, so those trees, whenever they breathe in the carbon dioxide, they actually breathe it in and they store it in the form of carbon, which is why the trees are big and hard and tough. I suppose that's why the wood is very powerful and very solid, because it has stored carbon, and all life on the planet, they are what scientists call, we are carbon-based life. So even at our basic building blocks, our main kind of thing that we're made up of as carbon, as they say. Now, there's all sorts of other chemicals that we're made up of, but basically it's carbon. And so when any of these animals or plants or anything like that, they die, and if they end up on the ground, like we're talking like dinosaurs, because that's why the dinosaurs, when we find their bones, they're not bones anymore. They've actually turned into like types of rock. And that's what they call fossilization. And that's also why we call the coal and the oil fossil fuels. But basically, what that does is all of that stored carbon, that is carbon that has been out of the system, that has been out of the atmosphere for millions of years. And that stored carbon has been hiding under the ground for all this time. And what we have been doing is we've been throwing all of that carbon up into the atmosphere. So there's more and more carbon dioxide. Boys discovered this in the Antarctic and the Arctic, where they do these very special ice core cutty things, where basically they cut down into the ice, and the layers of ice they can actually tell when the different layers of ice were formed, and they can get what they call almost like a snapshot of the atmosphere at the time. They can see what was in the atmosphere, and they have come to the conclusion that since the Industrial Revolution there has been a massive increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what does that do, you may be asking? Well, I discovered this, and it is quite interesting, and initially it might sound like good news, but here I am going to tell you today why it's not necessarily good news. So, all of this carbon going into the atmosphere basically is causing what is called the greenhouse effect. So all of this carbon coming into the atmosphere, now you cannot see it. I went outside to see if I could see it, but it doesn't work like that. In the same way, if you breathe out, you can't see the carbon dioxide coming, but the scientists are telling us that it is out there, and so it must be out there, because you may have noticed as the years have been going on, the news boys are saying more and more, this is the hottest year on record, this is the hottest summer on record, this is warm, and they're saying that it is getting very warm, and that's because some people might hear that and think, oh, sure, isn't it great? Particularly here in Ireland, because do you know what? Sometimes we barely get any summer altogether. It rains half the time and the other half it's cloudy. But sometimes we can get lucky, and sometimes we can reach 30 degrees for any Americans still using the Fahrenheit. 30 degrees, do you know what? I don't even know what it is in Fahrenheit, but it's warm. It's a nice warm day, but it's not too warm. It's not like Spain. I was in Spain on my holidays and it gets very warm there, but it wasn't as warm as that. So basically, all of this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is keeping the sun's heat locked in, just like in a greenhouse. So if any of you gardening enthusiasts out there, you might have a greenhouse. Well, let me tell you this: the sun, we know as when we go into the greenhouse that it is very warm in there, and the reason for that is all the glass in the greenhouse, it keeps in the heat, and the heat bounces around inside there, and it makes it great for all the plants, and that's not so bad for any plants that need that bit of heat. But the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, now it's not glass, but it's acting like glass, and that's what they're saying. So basically, it's actually keeping all of that glass. Well, it's not keeping the glass, it's keeping the heat inside the atmosphere, and basically the planet is warming up. Now, I was saying this to some of the boys down at the pub, and they were telling me that it was all a hoax, that it wasn't really happening, and they were kind of saying about, well, if you look at the weather, sure, we still get bad weather, and sure, sometimes the winters can be getting even colder as well. So how does that make any sense? Well, because whenever they said that it was a hoax, I was very relieved, because to be quite honest, I was getting quite worried about it. But then they said that it was a hoax, But I started looking into it because basically it's a lot more complicated than just what they used to call global warming. You might see in some films from even the 1980s and the 1990s where they're talking about global warming, like that great Kevin Costner film Waterworld from I think about 1995, which was all about global warming and the ice caps melting and basically covering all of the world in water because all of the ice caps melt. Well, these boys, they were onto something, but they didn't know all of the science because I was looking into it, and it's a lot more complicated than that. Now, that being said, there is rising sea levels, as they are saying that if the ice cap, because that's the thing, all of this ice is sitting up on the North Pole, up with Santi, and it's sitting all down on the South Pole as well. And it's sitting up in the big high mountains, up in the Himalayas and the Alps and the Rockies and all of these big mountains, all of these glaciers as they're called. And so the glaciers are melting because the world used to have a lot more ice in it. Like Europe, for example, used to be covered in ice, and that was, as some of you may know, some of you smart people who are paying attention, that was known as the Ice Age, and during that time, the northern hemisphere, it was covered in ice, and it was freezing, and it was very cold, and that's when the likes of the woolly mammoths were wandering about, and what that did, because there was so much white ice on the planet's surface, it actually bounced the sun's light and heat away from the planet, so it made it even colder. But it did eventually begin to melt, and some would say that it is continuing to melt as part of that process, although we can get back to that, because you have a case now where the ice caps are melting today, and what's happening, and a lot of people don't realise this, is because that's all fresh water. That's fresh water in that ice. I mean, sure, we've all gone out on a frosty morning and spread the salt out because salt melts the water. So you don't get salty ice. So all of that ice is fresh water. But of course, if that is going into the ocean, that's a whole pile of fresh water going into the ocean. And sure, the ocean is salty, but I have discovered that balance is very delicate. Some of the scientists, in fact, I say some, a lot of the scientists, as they say, 97% of the scientists are pointing to this, that all of this fresh water falling into the sea is making it less salty. And sure, you might think, sure, that's good because we can go to the beach and not worry about so much all the salt in the water. But there's a big problem with that. That amount of salt in the water allows for this big current, a big current of air across the North Atlantic Ocean that spins around and it stirs the air around, and it's lovely because what it does, it brings all the warm water up from the tropical places like Cuba and Jamaica and lovely places like that, and it pulls all of that lovely warm air up and it brings it all along the east coast of America, and then it throws it across the Atlantic over to Europe and it warms us up as well. And that was part of the reason why the Ice Age ended in the first place, was that warm air was blowing up from the tropics and from the equator itself, where the sun is the strongest, shining directly down onto the earth. But basically, all of that warm air has been thrown up, and it's warming up the northern hemisphere, essentially, or at least a part of it. But if there's too much fresh water in the ocean, that big current could shut down. And what that could mean, all of that warm air coming up from the tropics, from Jamaica, from Cuba, from all of those lovely warm places where we like to go on our holidays, all of that warm air is going to be cut off, and the likes of Europe could go back into the Ice Age. So I know it may sound a bit crazy, but what they're basically saying is global warming could potentially lead to another Ice Age, is what they're saying. And that's why it has since been rebranded from global warming to climate change. And that is what we do. You don't hear global warming so much anymore. But the funny thing is, they were talking about it for years and people didn't seem to be doing anything about it. They had science fiction films like the Waterworld, and it had references. I remember, and they were talking about it in Predator 2, which was based in the futuristic year of 1999, and people were sweltered because of global warming. So even then, people were aware of it. And then in the 2003 film, the Day After Tomorrow, I mean, that what I was just talking about there, about too much fresh water in the ocean, that is what the Day After Tomorrow was talking about. Now, I think it goes a bit extreme, and I don't think it is 100% accurate particularly about how fast it all happens. But still, it shows you that people have been aware of these things. But I suppose, much like the Day After Tomorrow, I don't think a lot of politicians have been listening to it, or have been properly taking it seriously. Now, in more recent years, we have had the likes of the Paris Agreement, where basically most of the countries in the world decided to say, okay, everybody, we have to work together and we have to stop, or what they are calling, we have to reduce our carbon footprint. And now, that's not about it. We're not talking about an actual footprint here, folks. What we are talking about is the amount of carbon that we leave in the atmosphere as they call a metaphorical footprint. And so the more carbon that we throw into the atmosphere, and that's by burning the coal, like I'm doing right now in the fireplace. I'm not innocent in all of this, as I have discovered. I drive my car as well, and sure, my car is burning petrol, and that petrol is throwing more carbon into the atmosphere. So there's loads of things, folks. So what is also happening is there's a lot of people who are denying that this is actually happening. I mean, the likes of the United States of America, as led by their President Donald Trump, he actually pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which, I mean, given how drastic this whole climate change, or some are actually calling it a climate crisis, it actually seems to be quite serious. But the fact that he has pulled out has led a lot of questions, because he was saying that he doesn't think, much like them boys that I was chatting to down at the pub, he also thinks that it is a hoax that was set up by the Chinese. Now, because the thing about China is basically China didn't have their industrial revolution at the same time as Europe and North America did. They have only really gotten into that later in the 20th century, and they have been burning a load of coal and a load of oil nowadays, and they have one of, if not the biggest economy in the world, and they produce a lot of things. You'll find a lot of things in your house that are actually made in China, believe it or not. But the some countries have gone to have said to China, would you not maybe not burn all of the coal, because we're all slowing down on the coal and we think you should do as well. And some of the Chinese in the past have said, well, all of your industry and all your what they call modern world is built on the foundations of the Industrial Revolution. So maybe they think that it is unfair that the Western world is telling them that they're not allowed to burn coal, when the Western world, being as successful as it is built on the fact that we already reaped the benefit of burning all of this coal. So I suppose I can understand that frustration. But at the same time, something needs to be done. And China is still part of the Paris Agreement, because they seem to be taking it seriously, but the United States of America is not. So I don't think they seem to be taking it very seriously. Some of the problems is the people who are denying that it is happening. I mean, all of the science is there. I mean, there's as they say, 97% of the scientists out there all agree that climate change is happening. But then there are some who are saying, but maybe it's not man-made climate change. But sure, all you have to do is look at, well, I suppose the fact that climate change is happening, because it is a fact, because it's not a coincidence that every single year is the warmest year on record. In order for this year to be the warmest year, it has to constantly be getting warmer. Otherwise, we would be sitting on, do you remember 2002, when that was the warmest year we've ever had? We're not sitting like that. Every single year is warmer than the last. So if you think about it on a very basic level, everything is getting warmer. And people are looking at the ice caps, they're looking at glaciers, they're all melting. Now, they're melting slowly, but the problem is, the smaller they are, the quicker they melt. In the same way as if you've got a little bit of frost, it'll melt very quickly. But if you've got a load of frost, and if you've got a load of snow, it'll sit. In that same way, if you have a good falling of snow, it'll sit. Even when it's not freezing anymore, it'll sit, because it takes a while for it to melt. But if there's only a wee bit of it, it won't sit. And that's the same with the glaciers on a massive level. If the glaciers are big, it'll take a lot for them to melt. But the smaller they get, the faster they'll melt. But the big question, I suppose, who is denying this? Who is really saying this? And I think a big problem. I think it's very telling that the United States of America have pulled out of the Paris Agreement because there's a lot of, as they say, a lot of money in politics. And I suppose it's something that I have been discovering. I've been looking into and finding out all of these things. And basically, there's a lot of companies, a lot of, as they say, corporations who are able to talk to politicians and basically say, look, we are creating jobs, we are creating money. Can you please make this law work for us? And that's what's happening. And so you have, and that might be okay if it's a good company. But if you're an oil company that is creating more carbon into the atmosphere, you're taking this carbon from the bottom of the ocean, and sometimes leaving devastation. Sometimes, particularly when they're drilling for oil, sometimes that oil can leak and it can get very messy. Like in the Gulf of Mexico, down off Louisiana. There was, it was fierce. There was a big massive oil spill, and they basically cut a hole in the ground and it started leaking all the way up, like if you stick a knife in the top of a Coke can and it just sprays everywhere. I saw that in a movie about it and it was very good. And I suppose the oil companies are concerned about making money because, well, that's what companies do. They have to make money. They're not a charity, they're a company. And I suppose they're really concerned about making money. So if all of the things that they own, if people are talking about not using oil anymore, then all of the oil companies are going to be in big trouble. Because if people stopped using oil tomorrow, the oil companies would be banjaxed. They would be in big trouble. So I suppose in some ways it would actually be in the oil company's best interest to keep the oil flowing. I suppose the oil companies actually want people to keep using oil. But the thing is that if we keep using oil, we're not fixing the problem. We're just putting more carbon into the atmosphere. But there is, for anybody who is listening very carefully, very early in this podcast, there is something out there, a very, very special thing that is able to take the carbon back out of the atmosphere. And that thing is a tree. The trees, as I was saying all the way back at the start, the trees breathe in that carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen. So not only that, they help us breathe too. And so all of this carbon in the atmosphere, if there were enough trees, they could just breathe all of that carbon dioxide in, and we wouldn't have a problem of the greenhouse effect. But the problem is, folks, is that not only do we not have enough trees, we're actually cutting down trees. You would think at a time like this, people would be planting loads of trees. People are actually chopping down trees. Over in Brazil and different places, in as much as the same way as people thousands of years ago here in Ireland chopped down loads of trees in order to make lovely big fields for cows. People are doing that today in Brazil because they want to make more and more fields for cows, because there are more and more people on this planet, and there are more and more people eating beef, and more people want to eat beef because the beef has been Now, don't get me wrong, I really like beef. I love myself a good steak, a good sirloin steak, rare. A nice rare steak is beautiful. But the problem is that more and more people want it all the time. And because of that, people are chopping down more forests. And so there's less trees to breathe in that carbon. But there's another problem, folks. All of those cows, they burp out another gas, and that gas is called methane. Yes, it is that same gas that we let out when we're blowing off. And that gas, that methane, whenever the cows are sitting there chewing the cud, whenever they're sitting there chewing up all of that grass, they're burping out all of this methane. And the methane is even worse than the carbon dioxide. The methane actually traps the heat of the sun even better than the carbon dioxide. So, folks, it's very, very serious. And not only that, but what's happening up in the ice caps as well, folks, speaking of methane, is that there's all of this, what they call permafrost, stuff that has been, the reason why it's called permafrost is because it was permanently frozen. So it's a very little smart word there, permafrost. But that permafrost, that stuff that has been frozen for years and years and years, if you imagine, it's like a freezer. If you have stuff sitting at the back of your freezer that has been frozen for ages, and all of a sudden you turn off the freezer, it's going to start to melt. It's going to start to defrost, and it's going to start to melt. And if you have a cabbage that you've had frozen, it's going to start to also decompose. And when plants decompose, they let off methane. If anybody has a lovely good compost heap, you might know that smell, that really bad smell that comes off a good compost heap. That is the methane of that decomposing. And what is happening at the ice caps is all of that permafrost, all of that soil, all of those leaves which have been lying there for thousands of years, frozen solid. And they stay frozen solid underneath these glaciers. All of a sudden now, folks, they're starting to defrost, like at the back of your freezer. And because they're starting to defrost, they're starting to release methane as well. So it's adding more methane. We've got carbon dioxide thrown into the atmosphere. We've got methane thrown into the atmosphere. Folks, this is crazy. It really is crazy. And you've got boys from oil companies who it's in their best interest to actually stop. It's in their best interest to keep the oil going and to keep the oil flowing. And they have tons of money because we're all paying for the oil, because we're all driving cars, we're all flying planes, we're all going over. And jet fuel, folks, is crazy. It's really bad from what I was reading. You can see now, folks, why I have been a bit nervous and a bit scared about the whole thing. And there's all sorts of different aspects to this. I mean, you've got the Republican Party in the United States, which denies that climate change is happening. But not only that, but amidst a lot of those Republicans, you've got a lot of what they call evangelical Christians, which are these. They're not Catholic. They're these boys, they are pretty sure, they're pretty confident that the apocalypse is coming very soon. They believe that Jesus and God and all of them boys are going to be coming very soon for the end of the world, for the book of Revelation. They believe that that's going to happen very soon. So I suppose it kind of makes sense if they're not really bothered with taking care of the world in the long term, if they think that they're only going to be living in it for the short term. So I suppose that kind of sounds a bit scary as well, if you think about it. So there's a lot of people scared about this. You've got the likes of that wee girl from Sweden, that Greta Thunberg, uh, and she's great, because I suppose she's only 16 years old or something like that, and she is telling the world what they should be doing, and I don't think it's very fair on her that she is having to do that, because she's only a Wayne. She's only 6. She shouldn't have to be worrying about this. But when you see all of the adults in the world, myself included, although I suppose I'm trying to find out more about this, so I'm trying to do my part, but all of the adults don't seem to have a handle on it, and they spend more time arguing amongst themselves about very stupid things, all the while, uh, the whole thing is the world is just completely warming up. It is a bit like I was watching a television show called Game of Thrones, and it was very complicated. There was a lot of people in it, and there was bad language and nudity in it as well, and it was very violent. To be quite honest, I'm not sure how I managed to last as long as I did, but I persevered because I suppose there was something that was driving me on. Now, I still haven't seen the last season yet, so don't tell me. I'm really looking forward to watching the last season. Don't tell me how it ends. I think it's going to be great, whatever happens, because I don't see it. I don't see them messing it up. I'm very excited because I've only just been catching up. But in this television show called The Game of Thrones, all of these different people are arguing, they're fighting, they're at war. People are dying, people are getting killed because they're all fighting about who gets to sit on the Iron Throne. Meanwhile, there's these boys up north of the wall, these white whackers as they're called, and they're whacking, and now, spoilers for the second last season, they break the wall and they're coming south. And I suppose the world is a wee bit like that at the moment, where a lot of politicians are arguing amongst themselves about all of these very stupid things, all the while the white whackers, or in this case climate change, is still happening and there's nothing being done about it. And I suppose we're wasting a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of resources in things that aren't really important and things that aren't really going to help with climate change. I mean, the amount of money in the world that is being put into making weapons, you can't shoot climate change. You can't blow up climate change. And so I don't really see the point in making more weapons, because you can't shoot climate change. Now, this climate crisis, a lot of people, like some of the boys down at the pub, they were telling me that because it was a whole hoax that I didn't need to worry about it. But then they started to say things like, well, sure, if we're to do anything, then India and China should do something about it first. But then, sure, I thought, if it was all a hoax and it wasn't happening, then why should we need to do anything about it, if you know what I mean? Because if it's not really happening, then we shouldn't really need to do anything about it. But if they're suggesting that India and China should do something about it first, to be quite honest, it sounds to me like they just couldn't be bothered doing anything about it, because I suppose that is a big problem, is that in order to do anything about it, we do need to change. And I think we can be recycling more. We can be trying to drive cars less, or maybe even trying. I hope some inventor somewhere can come up with an electric car. So they do exist, but I hope they can get better at making them. What I wonder is if they could make electric cars that basically you can change out the batteries, now, I know electric car batteries are very big and very complicated, but if they can get it to a point where you can take out batteries and replace them, I think it would be a great idea. And I think you could do it in Ireland very well, because Ireland is an island, so it's a closed network of cars. So basically, you could be driving along and drive into what was a petrol station but is now maybe a battery station or something like that, and you can take out your old battery and just put in a new battery, and off you go again, rather than having to wait to recharge. All of the batteries can be charging at the battery station, and if you're going on a particularly long journey, maybe you can get extra batteries to put in the boot or something like that. And maybe you could have something like your car tax actually covering battery use or battery maintenance or something like that. That maybe the batteries are actually like a publicly owned commodity or something like that. I think it could work if the technology could be developed for it. Now, some of the I said this idea to some of the boys down at the pub, and they were saying to me how there's loads of cars out there, and every single car would need to all have the same type of battery, and that would be very silly, and that wouldn't work, because why would every single car have the exact same battery and have the exact same design for things? But sure, I suppose they all have the same design of hole for the nozzle of a petrol pump, and they all have the same basic size for wheels. So I suppose it's not impossible to even try and design something that can work universally between different cars. And I think it might be in cars' best interests to maybe come up with that. I mean, if I knew how to do that kind of stuff, I would be doing it, because I think it would be a great idea. And I would love to see it happen, because I would love to have an electric car, because it would be like driving in the future, but today. Now, there's a lot of other questions about carbon tax, and putting carbon tax on people and the more carbon they use. So if you've got a crap car that pumps loads of carbon into the atmosphere, basically you have to do that. And while the carbon tax is good in principle, there doesn't seem to be a decent alternative at the moment. And I suppose it's a wee bit rich, just and I use that term not so ironically, I suppose, because you're putting tax on people who maybe even can't afford to do it, because quite often the cleaner solution can be the more expensive solution. And I think maybe they should be taxing like the big companies who are pumping loads and loads and loads of carbon into the atmosphere first, so that, and maybe putting that money aside so that they can maybe even give incentives for people to make the likes of electric cars, because like we have wind turbines here in Ireland, and some people complain about them. Some people say they wreck the countryside. I don't think so. I see that we have loads of them here in Donegal, and they're beautiful. I think they look really nice up on the hillside, and I've been driving up around them. Now, I can understand they can be quite noisy if you're right beside them, and that's fair enough. But if they're out of the way, I suppose it's a small price to pay. Obviously, no, I wouldn't necessarily be putting one on the top of Muckish or the top of Argyll, but I mean, where they are just outside of up the back of Drumkeen, I suppose it works because there's over 100 of them up there. It's a big wind farm because we get loads of wind. There's wind coming in off the Atlantic, and so there's loads of ways. My mammy just got the solar panels on the house, and that's a great deal. And it means that she doesn't have to pay. Sometimes she actually had her electric meter going backwards in the house. So that there's a load of options, but at the moment they just seem to be a bit expensive. And to add insult to injury, sometimes you could get slapped then with a carbon tax on top of that. So in Ireland, they are doing some reforestation. If you're going to chop down a tree, they want you to plant more trees, which is fair enough. And sometimes what is happening is they're planting loads of trees, but they're planting all the same tree. And sometimes they're even planting foreign trees that aren't even native to Ireland. And now I don't have any problem with foreigners, that's not the point here. But whenever you have a whole pile of one tree and no other trees, there's loads of animals that can't live there. Because I've walked in some of those forests and they're quite bare and they're quite quiet because there's nowhere for deer to hide. There's nowhere for the wee pine martens to hide. And so what happens is, if you have what they call a monoculture, only one culture, only one type of animal, basically they can't really grow or they can't really do much. But I suppose there's loads of ways that we could look at this. And there's loads of people who would wonder, is it really going to get as bad as that? Is it really going to get as drastically bad? Some people are saying that it is what they call an extinction level event, where basically the world is going to go extinct. Now, I don't think the world will go extinct, but I think there are already a lot of animals going extinct, and I think humanity can survive, but I don't think our society as it is at the moment can survive much longer. So to give you an example of a time in the very, very far past where things got out of hand, you had what was called the Great Permian Extinction. Now, this was millions and millions of years ago. This was before the dinosaurs, folks. This was a long time ago. But basically what happened was during the Permian period of time, there were loads of trees. Trees had just evolved out of the smaller plants, and so these trees were able, as we said at the very start of this podcast, and I'll be finishing up soon, so don't worry, but these trees were able to store carbon. This was the beginning of wood, folks. This was the beginning of that. And so all of a sudden, all of this carbon was being taken out of the atmosphere and stored in these trees. So all of a sudden, there was less carbon in the atmosphere and more oxygen in the atmosphere. And because of that, all of the wee creepy crawlies, they started to grow really big because they love oxygen. And if there's loads of oxygen, like really, as they say, oxygen rich, and all of these insects started to grow really big, and so you had all of these big giant creepy crawlies running around, and these trees, these big massive trees, and they would fall over. But the problem was that the wee funguses and stuff that break down trees, they didn't exist yet. They hadn't evolved yet. So all of that carbon got stored in all of these trees. So there was more and more oxygen in the atmosphere and less carbon in the atmosphere. But then a whole pile of things started to happen. There were all of these volcanoes that were what is now Siberia up in Russia, and there were volcanoes there, and those volcanoes erupted for about 10,000 years. That's a long time, folks, if you think about it. And they erupted for 10,000 years. And of course, you had all of this carbon stored in the ground. And all of those volcanoes, that it started to get very, very hot. And all of that carbon started to burn. And because there was so much oxygen in the atmosphere, the fires just kept going and going and going. You know, when the fire needs oxygen to burn, and if there's loads of oxygen, there'll be no putting that fire out anytime soon. That's why sometimes we even have carbon dioxide in some fire extinguishers, because the carbon can actually put out fire, but oxygen actually makes it burn. And so all of that carbon just started to burn and burn and burn, and all of that carbon got thrown into the atmosphere, created now this was a natural greenhouse effect, but this happened, and no animals necessarily did something on purpose to make this happen, but it happened anyway. And all of the world got so hot, and the oceans started, because the water started to get so hot as well. There was all of these bacteria or microbes in there, like little amoeba boys, and they were producing methane, and again they were pumping it up. It was making the ocean toxic, and most of the animals on the land died. Most of the animals in the water died. Only about 10% of the Earth's life actually survived this Permian extinction, as they call it. And we are descended from that 10%. There was 90% of the planet that hit an evolutionary dead end right there. And we are descended from that 10%. As were the dinosaurs. I mean, the dinosaurs came after this. This happened before the dinosaurs. This is hundreds of millions of years ago, folks. But it can happen. Now, how do we know about this? Because basically all of these very special scientists called paleontologists and different people like that, they basically work like detectives. They work like Sherlock Holmes, and they are able to look at clues in the ground, and they're able to work out what happened, and based on what they call the fossil record, they worked all of this out. So this is a drastic thing that happened thousands of years ago, and this was out of the hands of any life on the planet, but it still happened, and 90% of the planet's life died. Now, we are sitting here on the verge of a climate crisis, and in the middle of a climate crisis. Sure, look at Venice. Venice is flooded yet again, and people are still denying that the ocean levels are rising, but sure, Venice is flooded again. The flooding is happening. Look at the forest fires in Australia. Look at the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, of all of the coral. There's stuff dying. There's things that are burning, and it's all a bit crazy. And I suppose what I want to tell you about all of this, because I suppose I just want people to realize that it's happening whether you like it or not. And I was a bit upset when I found out about it, because I thought that my life would be just quite happy working away and driving my car and going here and going there and not really thinking about the environment and eating my beef and all of that. But I suppose it's something that we need to think about, because that's why Greta Thunberg is upset, because she has all of the future ahead of her. Her adult life will be in the future. And I was lucky. I was a teenager during the 2000s. And now I suppose we did have the bad things like 9/11 and the war in Iraq and different things like that. And it was a bit scary, I suppose. But and then we had the financial crisis in 2007, 8 and 9. I suppose it wasn't a great time to be a teenager either. The 90s were good to be a child, I will say that, because the world seemed to be a bit calmer, particularly after the Cold War. But I suppose if you think that it's scary being an adult, imagine what teenagers are thinking now as they are learning about all of this, because this is the science, this is what is happening, and they don't see people doing enough about it. So have a think about what you're doing. And politicians, I suppose, maybe stop listening to the oil companies, because you might make some money from them now, but you're not going to have a decent world to spend it in, because the world is going to be very different, and I don't think it'll be for the better, to be very honest. So invest in better, invest in green energy, as they call it, and I suppose that's as much as we can do for now. And I suppose it's what they call a downer, I suppose, to end it on. But I wish I could be more hopeful at the moment about climate change. But that is where we're at the moment. So this has been the first episode of the Peadar O'Donnell podcast. I'm sorry it got a bit dark there at the end, but such is the world of climate change. If you liked this, please subscribe, either here on YouTube or on the podcasting site. And I'm going to be talking about a load of different things over the next while. I'm going to be talking to other people. I'm going to be interviewing other people. We're going to be talking about different things like the LGBTQ plus community. This thing I discovered online called white privilege, and all sorts of different things like that. So I suppose for now I am going to finish up, but thank you so much for listening, and I will chat to you again. You've been listening to the Peadar O'Donnell Podcast, created by John D Ruddy. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at John D Ruddy, and subscribe to all my YouTube channels, John D Ruddy and John D Ruddy Does Stuff. Help support the creation of new content through Patreon. This helps me survive to make more. Thanks for listening.